my PhD was all about parasites, parasitism, ecology of parasites. So I've long been fascinated with infectious disease, epidemiology, all of these kind of parameters. And unfortunately, we all got introduced to that a couple years ago. So we're all now kind of familiar with some of these, terms, some of these, concepts. And group living is one of the things. We just talked about how efficient it is, how it makes sense evolutionarily, that it would evolve even at small group sizes, some of the benefits. But one of the costs is infection risk. So when one individual gets infected, they can then spread it to the group. And there's been constantly this, people call it the arms race, right, between parasites or viruses, bacteria, pathogens, and groups and individuals and all this stuff. So you looked at some of these factors and you were specifically interested in behavior. So where an individual chooses to move within its group or, is destined to move. I guess destined is the wrong word, but what their job is, dictates where they move in a group. And pathogens also have, particular places where transmission is higher. So there's a lot of factors going on here. So maybe I'll give it to you to try and explain your study rather than sort of throw out a bunch of stuff.
No. Okay, but you got it right. It's like a very good intro for the study. Yeah, so basically, I think the starting point for this work was that, and first of all, I want to say this work and the kind of proposal that went to it was done before the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
So this was not something that was actually triggered by the COVID pandemic, but that suddenly became, some of the questions became suddenly things that were on everybody's mind. So it has become surprisingly very easy to introduce that work because you find that most people in the audience actually have become unwilling experts of disease transmission and then have had to think about those questions a lot. And so I think this would be quite intuitive for most listeners. So essentially, when you think of, as you said, social groups are very susceptible to disease transmission because of those high rates of interaction between individuals. So this is a major risk of group living. And in many social groups, there are many factors that will influence your likelihood to become infected by something, right? There's your genetic background, there's your age, there's where you go, with whom you interact, and so on. Many different factors that complicate the question, and often in like for example, natural populations of animals, it's very hard to know which to what extent each of those factors played a role in that individual animal being sick now, right? And we thought that, well, the clonal variant is quite nice again to disentangle those effects. And by then we had developed those tools that allow to really follow the behavior of each individual in a group, which we could deploy to address questions about disease transmission. And so the question that we wanted to address first here was, well, we've all been thinking a lot about, or like we are all well aware now that your own behavior is an important factor is going to influence your likelihood to become infected, because again, where you go, with whom you interact, what you do are all things that very intuitively, should affect the likelihood that you contract an infectious disease. But often those things will correlate with other things. So for example, in the context of the pandemic, we know that young people, of course they are younger, but they also behave differently, right? So they might be more prone to go to parties, or they might, but young age also impacts the immune system. So, there might be different effects playing out in the outcome of an infection, and many of those are confounded, or like they correlate in a way and they're hard to disentangle. And so what we set out to do was to use the clonal variant. By that point, we knew that we would have differences in behavior, that we would have division of labor, even among clonal individuals of the same age, and we knew this from the 2018 study. We knew that those differences would emerge in small clonal variant colonies. And we wanted to know whether then those individuals that took on different jobs in the colony, that took on different tasks, were then at different risk of becoming infected, in that case with a nematode that we study in the lab. And it was the case, and it was very clearly the case. So the differences were pretty strong. So if you're a forager in an ant colony, and forager means you go out of the nests, you tend to explore, to look for food, and to cover a broader also spatial range. Like you go to many different places. And we found that foragers were at a much higher risk to become infected. They become infected earlier, more of them become infected, and also they end up with higher parasite loads than their genetically identical nestmates who tended to stay in the nest more.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very simple finding, but one that really shows that behavior itself, so behavior alone, can drive the risk of becoming infected. And also a direct consequence of that is that so the distribution of parasites in a social group really reflects division of labor within that group, right? To the point that you may, in those experiments, we didn't try, but we might have been able to guess what behavioral role an individual was in charge, or what behavioral role an individual had based on its infection load.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that's, again, it feels intuitive to us, and I think especially now, like you said, this work was started before the pandemic, but now we've all become, sort of accustomed to thinking about this, or we were all introduced to it, and that's kind of intuitive, right? Like it makes sense if you're going to go out into the world where the parasites are, where the pathogens are, you're more likely to get more parasites, right? But it's something, again, that we don't necessarily think of on a deeper level other than that, or at least we didn't. Maybe now we do. But that your behavior and, in this case, like the job that you're required to do in the group is going to put you at a higher risk. But so then what is sort of the consequences of that, from an evolutionary perspective or from a group living perspective? Is the idea that, well, the group then has to, sort of devise ways to, halt the spread, or, maybe it's in other groups where genetics does play a role. Certain individuals will have a different genetic disposition against different parasites. Like, what's the consequence of this? Now that we know, like you said, a sort of neat, simple finding that some people are going to have more risks than others. What's the next question? What's the consequence of this for the group?
Oh, yes. Okay. And first of all, I should be clear that I cannot give any public health
No,
advice.
for sure. Yeah,
So I don't know what we should do in human societies. I can tell you a little bit about how ants deal with those things, both at kind of the um, evolutionary level, what kind of behaviors they have evolved to deal with those things, and also at the proximate level, which is how they immediately react. So in general, in ants, colonies, normal ant colonies, in which you have normal demographic structure, like variation and so on, like larger natural colonies that you might find outside your house. It's always the old individuals that go out. Or like there's a very strong tendency for older individuals to go out and forage, and to be exposed to the external environment. And this is really one of the few things that seem to be true across the board. It happens in honeybees, it happens in ants, and I think virtually any social insects where this question has been looked at. And the idea is that, well, those tasks are riskier. They are not only riskier in terms of pathogens, but also predation and so on.
Right.
You're more like it's more dangerous to go out. And so there's an idea that basically then you give those tasks to the older individuals in the colony because those have lower residual value, lower remaining value to the colony.
Yeah. It's a very harsh calculation, but
yeah. I mean, nature is harsh, and so that's the idea, right? That's and then you don't expose your younger workforce to those risks, or you only expose them to those risks later on, when they have already kind of contributed to the colony's success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of one of the evolutionary explanations for how you can kind of mitigate that risk by sending a subpart of the social group to the external environment. And luckily we don't do this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, and then also, so basically the idea is also that social insects have evolved ways that to organize the colonies in a way that then limits the spread of those pathogens within the colony. So again, within a normal ant colony, not all individuals have the same value to the colony. Right? The queen is super important. If there's a queen, then she's super important because she is the only one who can reproduce. If the queen dies in many ant colonies, the colony dies.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's thought that social insects have evolved many strategies to kind of limit the spread of infectious disease in the colony. And one of them is that they seem to have restricted interactions between groups of workers who have different jobs, essentially, right? So that the foragers, who are the ones who go outside and are most likely to bring back pathogens to the nest, those foragers will not interact with the queen. And they will only have limited interactions with the workers that are the entourage of the queen, if you want.
Right.
And so there's a notion that basically the structure of social networks within a colony and the spatial segregation and the way they organize themselves has evolved to some extent, at least, to protect the colony against uncontrolled pathogen spread. Yeah, and so and those structures of social networks, some people or other, not us, but other studies have shown that they can even change plastically upon exposure to pathogens, right? And that's really interesting. So they seem to be able to, they have those constitutive levels of defense, which is represented by how they are organized, at baseline in normal conditions. And when they detect the presence of a pathogen, they seem to be able to strengthen those barriers even.
Mm-hmm.
But what we saw in our own study was something different altogether. And what we observed is that upon exposure to those nematodes, so the individuals that are exposed actually tend to spend more time in the nest. And this, from the host perspective, from the ant's perspective, is not very good, right? So if you're infected and then you run back to the nest and then spend all your time, in the nest, that seems counterintuitive, because then you should be at a higher risk of propagating the disease.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of quarantine, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so this kind of surprised us, to be honest. We were expecting the ants to do something different entirely, and we are still not sure. But this made us think that maybe the parasite itself, that the behavioral changes in the hosts, as we observe them, if anything, should benefit the parasite, which again raises a host of other interesting questions, some of which you have studied yourself, right?
Yeah, the idea of the parasite manipulating the host for its own benefit. Yeah, I think this is, again, we would think, and obviously, you can't give public health advice, and it's a model system of ants is very different than humans and stuff. But it's fascinating to me, this idea that our relationship with pathogens, all of organisms' relationships with pathogens really does structure or influence evolution in a way, how we evolve, how we live, right? So the ants have evolved these, kind of barriers in their division of labor that is a protection against disease. There's so many things, other social groups, whether it's grooming or, things like this, there's all of these intrinsic behaviors that are because of our relationship with pathogens in the outside world and stuff. And so in a way, again, I don't want to keep hammering on the pandemic experience, but that was a very shocking thing for most people. But when you think about it, it's really it's such an intrinsic part of life, of being a living thing, is dealing with infection and how that influences our behaviors and how our behaviors influences infection risk. So these are all like really sort of fundamental questions and really kind of fascinating. I wonder what you think of that sort of statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always really try hard not to anthropomorphize my ants and, try to be careful not to extrapolate too much. But in this context, it was really hard not to draw parallels sometimes, right? Because for example, this different exposure to disease that different members of a group are facing. We saw it in the pandemic to some extent in the context of healthcare workers
Yeah,
in
yeah.
front lines, and they were taking risks, right, consciously, to be exposed to this pathogen in order to take care of other people, right? Um, and ants do this as well, right? They do care for each other. So like, you will often see them grooming each other when a nestmate is exposed to a disease, instead of ignoring that individual altogether, or just letting it to deal with the infection on their own. So there's a lot of helping behavior, there's a lot of care behavior that you see in societies that we also have, obviously.